Gavin Fortunia from Nonlinear, and I'm here with two of our Sitecore MVPs to talk about one of our more popular posts, the 12 Laws of Sitecore Development. With me is Jason St. Cyr. Jay, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey there, I'm Jason. I'm a Sitecore solution architect here at Nonlinear.
And we also have Nick Allen.
Hey there, Nick Allen, also a solution architect.
Okay, guys, so we've got a lot of feedback on this post, and there seems to be an appetite for a little bit more. So we've got two of our more knowledgeable folks here to talk about it. I'll just start briefly the conversation. There is quite a breadth of areas covered by the post. I think one that stands out the most, though, in the feedback I've seen is how important it is and how much effort should be spent in developing a set of guidelines for all of your developers on a Sitecore project. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think when I look at the types of things that we tend to put together, I think there's guidelines that we put together that are for best practices as a developer, as here's how you write good code, and then there's best practices as a developer, here's how you make a Sitecore solution that's actually going to be usable for your content authors. Like, what are those types of best guidelines? And I think that's really where it becomes really important, at least for me. Everybody's got their own style, and I think there's a lot of things that we try to teach our developers to kind of bring up that base level of what's the minimum quality we want to put out. But really, if the solution is great code, but the authors can't use it, that's where the solution starts falling apart. So I think that's really where we focus on developer guidelines. I know, Nick and I go back and forth all the time on, how should we do these? Should we use Lambda expressions? Blah 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 blah. And that's great from a discussion perspective, but it doesn't really help the end user's business value a whole lot. I mean, there's a little bit on your ops cost, maybe ongoing technical debt, things like that. But I think one of the examples, things like thumbnails, such a simple thing to forget, but having all of your developers know, oh yeah, I created a component. It needs a thumbnail that represents what that component is.
Yeah, I think the other thing with that as well is, especially during the development phase, we tend to look at sometimes siloed pieces of work, and we build things out and we test them in sort of controlled circumstances, but it's also encouraging people to think about, if you're that person who's going to be using that system as your primary tool on a day-to-day basis, what's that going to be like when you're repeating that process X number of times? And we often, as developers, don't get to see that side of things. So a lot of our best practices come from that as well, is thinking through the eyes of that content author who's going to be doing this, repeating these tasks on a very frequent basis.
Yeah, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the move that we made a few years ago to the agile kind of user story base, where we're thinking about requirements from what is it that the user that is going to use this functionality, what is it they need, as opposed to the previous model of like, well, what's the technical requirement for the system? And trying to think of it from that user-focused environment. I think that's really where having guidelines for that really helps the team think about it from a user-centric kind of way.
So it really sounds like there's two facets to the question. It's really the end-user focused elements as well as the back-end piece. If you had to boil it down, is there a single one tip that you could give to developers new to Sitecore in both areas?
Don't try to rewrite Sitecore. I think that's a common mistake that people try to make. Yeah. Especially when if you're coming from traditional sort of .NET web application development, you tend to come from a background where you have a lot of practices already, ways of doing things, ways of approaching certain challenges, and sometimes the temptation is, when you're first getting started with Sitecore, is to approach the project trying to reintroduce all of that into a Sitecore project, and then a lot of those things have been taken care of for you. So whenever you're approaching a specific situation or challenge, instead of trying to, I'll say, fix it yourself, chances are Sitecore have already thought of it, and there's a way to do it and again, air quotes, Sitecore way.
Yes, and I mean, there's the try not to break the product out of the bat, but there was something that I think it was my trainer down in Boston when I went for Sitecore training the first time that said, don't customize the product until you've done at least 2 big projects on the platform. And the reasoning behind that was, you as a new developer probably have a lot of chops and probably have a lot of ideas of how you would want to do things, but you need to know how the product does stuff first before you try to alter how the product does that. And actually, since that happened, right, there was a lot of stuff in my first 6 months looking at Sitecore after years and years and years in the .NET development world, where I don't understand why it's doing this way. I just want to build it this way. But I tried to hold back, and I listened to those that were more experienced than I was here at Nonlinear with how they worked with Sitecore through the years. And it does. You get to a point where you don't have to customize the product. There's going to be that moment where you get to the point where your knowledge base has exceeded what is in the core product, and now you know of how to do things even better. And sure, at that point, maybe now you can start trying to extend the platform a little bit more. But definitely my tip that I would give a developer is to, like Nick said, stay within the confines of the product. Use it as the platform as it's intended, and try to solve your solution there. And only deviate if you really need to.
Yeah, and I don't want that to come across as saying that Sitecore restricts you in any way. It's a very open platform. It's very easy to extend.
Too easy.
Too easy, yeah. A lot of people would say it's too easy, kind of like the agile fragile thing. But it's and I think now, I've been working with Sitecore for around 7 years now, and back sort of if you go even sort of 5 years ago, there wasn't that much material online from developers or MVPs, so it did feel very much more like you're sort of out in the Wild West trying to make Sitecore do things that it's not doing. But now there's so much more material out there. So if you are in a situation where, as Jason says, your domain knowledge of what you're doing is stronger than what Sitecore has, there are ways to extend the product elegantly, I'll say. And there's lots of, so many people out there blogging about these things now that, again, if you ever feel like you're getting close to customizing the product, there's probably a way to extend it in a better way.
Yeah, I think when you're saying extend it too, there's like 5 or 6 different ways you can extend any given piece of the product, and how is it Sitecore is going to be best extended, right? So that you can preserve an upgrade path, or most efficiently access the type of information that you need to use. So, for example, do I use an event handler or do I use a pipeline processor? Those types of decisions, you can go either way, but it takes a little bit of experience of understanding, well, what is the way that the Sitecore themselves would have done it? Or how have other people out there in the world, you take a look at folks that are MVPs already out on the web and they're posting stuff, and you can just go read their blogs. They've got years and years of experience of doing things, and maybe some of it has even been rolled into the product now. Like I can't imagine what the amount of information that's in Alex Sheeta's brain that doesn't exist on the web already. That guy alone has been building so much stuff that just reading his blogs, you learn so much about how the product works.
Yeah, or even going to the marketplace, and a lot of the modules out there come with source code. Download the source code, have a look.
It sounds like there's a wealth of knowledge out there for new Sitecore developers. Also sounds like perhaps, if not patience, but discipline in making sure that they're making informed decisions about how they're building their solutions. On that vein, what is something that you would that developers often see as sort of the best thing about working in Sitecore? I mean, there's a lot of capabilities, a lot of possibility, but is there any one thing that stands out to you guys?
I think if I was going to say one thing, for me, it's the ease with which it allows someone who's used to .NET web applications to seamlessly kind of bring their knowledge sphere into working with the CMS. It's not breaking the model of how you think about a web application. If you used to build an e-commerce website and it had a shopping cart on it and it's going to submit to a payment provider, it works the same way. You're just, how do you get your content out in terms of making sure you're accessing the content information in the database? Okay, that's a new piece that you've got to learn. But a lot of your base domain knowledge that you have from building .NET web apps, whether it be the ASP.NET Forms way or the MVC way, all of that applies. And I think for me, that's the big plus that you get as a developer, is that you can, without having any knowledge of the product, come in with something you can bring to the table.
Yeah, and I think as well, it embraces kind of the separation of presentation. So it's pretty straightforward to have, say, front-end developers working on a project at the same time as back-end developers, and those front-end developers having no knowledge of Sitecore whatsoever, you can still have them working in that same project space.
Although I would say that while they can be working in the same project space, that we have found that those developers who can do both tend to be more efficient because they can see the full picture. And I think sometimes that is something that can get in the way.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Maybe one last question before we wrap this up. We talked about for developers the concept of the author experience in Sitecore may be perhaps unintuitive or maybe a new nuance to the development of a solution that takes some getting used to. Are there any other aspects or elements that will seem maybe a little bit different, a little bit strange to folks who are new to the platform?
I think someone who's their first time ever trying to develop on the platform is maybe not going to understand how pipelines work. Like that, it's so fundamental to how Sitecore goes from point A to point B, and it's not something that's generally done in a lot of .NET Web apps. Most folks are building their stuff very much as like, this is the presentation layer, it calls my business layer, it's calling the data layer. There's not a whole lot of stuff running under the scenes. So I think that's probably a place. Now, Nick, you've played around a lot with those pipelines. Do you see anything else other than the pipelines that might be like one of those like gotchas that you would go and see?
The Sitecore context. That's definitely right. There are certain situations where that context is going to be available to you and certain situations where it's not. So you certainly have to be aware of that. And that's when you start getting into things like adding additional, say, buttons to the Sitecore ribbons, or if you're doing kind of automated processes, you're not always going to have that context. In some cases, you also have partial context, and I think it's kind of understanding that. And then also, a lot of the times now, in a lot of projects we work in, it's rare to not work in a situation where you've got a separated content management instance from content delivery instances, and just understanding the implications of that, especially as most clients, as part of your scalability settings, will, for example, remove the master database or references to it completely. That can cause havoc if you're not aware of the consequences of that. That's definitely one I think is an initial gotcha and takes a bit of experience to understand really what's going on there.
Yeah, the scalability settings is a really good point, because even here at Nonlinear, a lot of us are used to doing our development on our local box, and you set up your one development instance, and you go and you write your code, and you make sure everything's good, and then the first thing we do is we deploy it out to a multi-node test environment, and suddenly something doesn't work right, and we don't know why. And that's one of those things that you start learning, okay, well, now I've got to set up my development environment really does have to start out scaled, and thinking about the separation of content delivery from content author. That is, you're right, that can be a little bit tricky to get a hold of. I think that part of the problem you get in there is, like you mentioned with the Sitecore context, is you've got that master database, the web database, whether or not you have access to those, and which one is actually being loaded. Like we've found plenty of times where it turns out, oh, well, the context got switched database for some reason, so the content's being loaded from the wrong database. And that simple piece, like it could be a one line of code that suddenly switched everything, and nothing's working anymore. So that could definitely cause havoc with a development team that's maybe new to the product.
And I think, yeah, for sure, I agree with what you said there. But I think also, again, a day one gotcha is being aware of the fact that the code that you're writing is also going to be running underneath the page editor. So that, page editor now is no longer, I don't see it no longer as optional. It is, part of the core product is the ability to leverage DMS. To leverage DMS, you're going to have content authors in page editor mode, adding components to the page, personalizing them, using them for A/B tests. And a lot of rich internet applications these days make heavy use of JavaScript. A lot of the times that JavaScript can cause havoc in page editor mode. And it's also thinking about things like sliders. Obviously, you can't have elements on the page moving around when content authors are in there actually trying to edit that content. So understanding that you're writing code for two different situations completely, and how to write that code to work in both is definitely something that takes a while to get used to.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for your thoughts. I think we've provided a lot of things for the listeners here to consider, and maybe we'll be able to expand the 12 laws to 24 next time. So thanks again, and we'll talk again soon.